including say Eastern Europe, say Poland. My pleasure to introduce our host today, Congressman Paul Kanjorski.
Thank you, Bob. The purpose of this is to have some people with expertise discuss some of the ramifications and problems that may result in our choice of leadership in the United States. And for that purpose, we've had the honor of having former Ukrainian ambassador, Marie, and we have former Congressman Tom Malinowski, who has a great history that I've followed in the Congress because he's such an outstanding guy. And then we have a fine professor from Kutztown University, Dr. Holovic. And I reserve the right to mispronounce names because I've got a tough one myself. It's always mispronounced. But what we'd like to do is, I think, have a few-minute discussion by each individual here from how they look at the overall relationship of Poland, Ukraine, and the United States, and how that may be impacted by the election or by other actions that are occurring in the world. And then maybe open up for some good direct questions, which most of us deserve being penalized with because we think we're so damn smart on this thing. So first of all, we'll call on the ambassador, if we will, to give us some of her experience.
Do you want me to go first?
Did you want me to go
I
first?
Yeah.
I think they
Yeah.
wanted me to go first.
Oh,
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
It's only because
Sort of for the historical perspective?
yes. So they wanted me to go first because I'm speaking on behalf of the Ukrainian American community here in northeastern Pennsylvania and eastern Pennsylvania. You may not realize that, I guess as of the last census, there are well over 100,000 people that claim to be of Ukrainian descent here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So I've spent the last month or 6 weeks being interviewed by a lot of press from around the world and around the United States who are interested in how will Ukrainian Americans vote? Will they vote as a bloc? And it really has to do with how well we identify with our Ukrainian heritage. Even though technically I am a second and third generation Ukrainian American, our community here in northeastern PA very strongly identifies with their Ukrainian roots. So our people would have come here beginning in the late 1890s and into the turn of the last century, as we all know who live here, to mine coal. And were brought over by the coal companies, the whole American dream story. But I think because we maintain a unique religious presence, we are not Roman Catholic, we are either Eastern Greek Catholic. In the United States they say Ukrainian Catholic, in Ukraine they say Greek Catholic, or Orthodox. I myself, my mother is Greek Catholic and my father's Orthodox, and I'm a member of the Eastern Orthodox community. So because of our unique religious heritage, we've really maintained our separate churches with a strong ethnic identity. So that my children now, who would be third and fourth generation, strongly identify as Ukrainian. We speak the Ukrainian language, we maintain the culture. So we are a strong voting bloc. We have been working tirelessly since day one of the war to raise money for humanitarian aid through our churches and our organizations. The other strong factor is the post-World War II immigrants who were displaced, and some of our other guests, that's the story of their families, who were brought over under the Displaced Persons Act. I have many friends, that's how they got here. They were born in camps, in displaced person camps. And one of them discovered he was not an American citizen when he was trying to be drafted. They were drafting him to Vietnam, and they found out he was a German citizen, and then gave him citizenship very quickly. So their roots were fleeing communism, displaced by World War II, and they and their parents. And they've settled here in northeastern PA. They're in the Lehigh Valley, a very strong community, and a very huge community in the Philadelphia area. Another wave of immigration came through in the 1990s. I have friends that came over as the Soviet Union was falling apart, and they were brought over, again, under special religious visas. And they are all American citizens now, I was asking, and they are all voters and voting in the elections and maintain they had never missed an election. And of course, we have the newer waves of immigrants, some of them coming over for economic reasons, and of course those displaced by the war who are here under the special U for You program. Of course, none of those people are eligible to vote, but what they do is they revitalize the community. So every time you think we're going to switch to English, I have not spoken so much Ukrainian like I have in the last 6 months, because you're bringing in new immigrants, you're helping them get settled, they don't speak English, we're running programs for them, their children are coming to our dance camp. So we have this intergenerational interaction from the first wave of immigrant, grandchildren and great-grandchildren to the brand new kids that are just here, which keeps the community very vibrant and also very much connected to our Ukrainian roots.
Thank you very much, and now we'll go to the far side of the table here.
Now that we have the historical perspective, I just want to pick up on the cultural theme, because that is something that I am very attuned to. I've spent 6 years of my adult life in Ukraine, and as those of you who are probably all of you here in this room know what a vibrant culture Ukraine has. And that culture, when it comes to the United States, I think reinvigorates our culture. And I think that's important to understand. We often talk about how immigrants in America are kind of the lifeblood of our economy. And they bring innovation and new ideas and hard work and all the things that we need to keep our economy the best in the world, the biggest in the world. But the cultural aspect, I think, is really important as well. And we see it in so many different ways, whether it's in the movies, whether it's in music, whether it's in the vyshyvankas that Paula is wearing. And when I think about the war in Ukraine, and I probably don't need to remind the people in this room, but Russia's war of aggression, we could probably say it started hundreds of years ago against Ukraine, but in modern times, we say it started in 2014. When Putin snatched Crimea with no provocation and then started the war in the Donbass. So it's been going on for 10 years now, 10 years through three administrations. And I wish that we could solve it immediately. There's nothing probably more that anybody in this room would like than to solve it in 24 hours. But I think the reality is that these are complicated issues, complicated times, and this is a war that is going to require thoughtful negotiations, not like the negotiations that took place in 2014, 2015, the so-called Minsk protocols, which were supposed to bring a ceasefire and then eventual peace, and frankly did neither, and really did a disservice to Ukraine. Ukraine was up against the wall and agreed to this agreement, and the result is that the war continued. Didn't always make the headlines in the United States, but there were 3 or 4 Ukrainians, whether they were soldiers or people that were living in the wrong place at the wrong moment. 3 or 4 people, Ukrainians, would die every week, and that didn't make our front pages, but it was a raging war. And then, of course, the Russians used that time to rebuild, to rest, to allegedly revitalize their military, and then they started again with huge energy in 2022 for the full-on invasion of Ukraine. And what they wanted to do was not just grab more territory, they wanted to do that as well. They wanted to destroy the Ukrainian nation. And so that brings me back to the cultural point. Putin claims openly, as do those around him, that there are no Ukrainian people. I mean, people in this room, we just heard from Paula, clearly there are Ukrainian people. There is a Ukrainian language, there is a Ukrainian culture, there are Ukrainian religions. This is a vital culture and people and nation. And Putin's war of aggression is about destroying all of that and taking it away. He has openly said that what he wants to do is reconstitute the former Russian Empire. And that includes all of Ukraine. but even more so, it includes, some of the countries or parts of some of the countries in what we used to call Eastern Europe, now Central Europe. Many of those countries now, part of NATO, part of the West. Those countries don't want to go back to being another country's vassal or part of an empire. They want self-determination, one of the key elements in the UN Charter, which the Soviet Union and then Russia signed up to. I mean, there are all sorts of international principles that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has violated. I think that it's important that we as Americans stand against this and provide assistance to a country like Ukraine that was brutally invaded, and that invasion continues today, and help them with everything that we can. Because this war is about Ukraine. It is about Ukraine's culture. It is about Ukraine's territory, but it is also about much more. Putin, if he is successful in Ukraine, it will be a tragedy for Ukraine, a tragedy for the world, but it will also be a tragedy for Central Europe. We will be dragged into, in my belief, we will be dragged into a much more serious war. And so if we can help the Ukrainians today, if we can invest in Ukraine's future, but also our own future and our own security and our own economy by helping Ukraine with as much as we can provide today on time, in the timelines that Ukraine needs it in order to make a difference, we can make a difference. And I think Ukraine can prevail. But it is a tough fight, and we need to put everything into it. And I would just say that sometimes there is a belief, I think, that why are we sending all this money to Ukraine? Because, we have priorities here at home. And that is absolutely right. We have a lot of important priorities here at home that we need to be attending to. But we also have foreign policy priorities because it has to do with our national security. And the thing about foreign assistance, whether it is humanitarian assistance or security assistance, is that most of that money, up to 95%, stays right here in the United States. We are, the equipment that we provide to Ukraine is built here in the United States by American workers. It's building our economy, creating American jobs. I think it's important to remember that even as we are doing the right thing, the smart thing in helping Ukraine, we are also doing the right thing for ourselves and helping our own security. I could go on, but I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and hopefully you'll ask lots of questions because there's a lot more to say.
Thanks. I'm not sure if can you guys hear me? Okay.
Sure.
Do you need it for the video?
No, because that's,
okay.
These are picking up. So I guess my job is to speak for the Polish side of the equation, and I always feel really at home in this neck of the woods. Last time I was here, had some great pierogi that were served at the last event by this wonderful lady here, and I'm a little disappointed that we don't have any today. I was born in Poland, came to America when I was 6 years old. The unofficial slogan of my first campaign for Congress was, of course, Malinowski for the Houski, which half of my supporters groaned and hated, the other half loved. It became a cult thing, and eventually I think the half that hated it came around. And that campaign, congressional campaigns are mostly not about foreign policy. I wasn't running as a Polish person or as a Polish American, but it is a big part of who I am, the lessons my family taught me. My family in Poland were pretty much like all Poles, fighters for something. My grandfather died defending Warsaw from Hitler in 1939. My aunt, who just recently passed away as a teenager, was a medic in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. My grandmother and her sisters spent the war sheltering Jewish friends and neighbors, and never asked for any credit, never asked for any praise for it because they didn't think they'd done enough. And that was kind of the ethos that I was brought up with. And, look around the world today, where is that ethos best exemplified? It's obviously in Ukraine. And I think most Americans get this. The sympathy with Ukraine is completely bipartisan. In fact, I saw a poll recently that asked people the very simple question: who do you sympathize with in this war? Do you sympathize more with Russia or with Ukraine? And the results were 65% sympathize with Ukraine. And what do you think the number was for Russia? What's that?
35?
3%. So this wasn't even asking about aid. Most Americans support aid to Ukraine, but that's a little more, balanced. 3% sympathize with Russia. And I think the reasons are pretty obvious. This is actually pretty simple at its heart. You had an act of naked aggression by a brutal tyrant to seize the territory of a smaller neighboring country that happens to be a democracy that wants to be aligned with us. You have the Ukrainian people fighting with incredible courage and bravery, succeeding where most people thought that they would fail. And you have these stakes for the United States and for the world, because I think most people intuitively get that if you let Putin get away with changing borders with tanks, with seizing this country, then every other tyrant in the world, including China, very importantly for us, gets the message that you can get away with this now. And as Marie said, Poland would be next, our NATO allies would be next. And if the war reaches them, it reaches us by definition, because NATO would require us to go to war to defend Poland and our other NATO allies. And yet, despite the stakes for us, the Ukrainians have never once asked us to fight this battle for them. Their message is, we'll do the fighting ourselves. We will literally put our bodies between you and your greatest adversary. We'll do all the bleeding. All we want from you, all we ask of you, is ammunition. And economic ammunition in the form of a little bit of economic aid, but mostly the guns and ammunition that will enable us to stay in this fight. And frankly, right now, they're a little bit nervous because they're wondering, they know we're having this election, they're wondering, is the United States going to have their backs? My friends in Poland are nervous. They're wondering, is the United States going to continue to defend NATO, to be a power in Europe, standing up against tyranny for democracy? And I think it's pretty clear to them, and should be pretty clear to us, that the fate of Ukraine, and therefore of our allies, is going to depend as much on the outcome of our election as it depends on any battle being waged right now between the Ukrainian and Russian army. That the ballots we cast in a couple of days are going to determine whether they have bullets in the weeks and months ahead to defend not just themselves, but to defend us. That's what they're doing. And so we need to feel the stakes in this election when it comes to Ukraine, Poland, and our national security. Now, in this debate, people say a lot of stuff. They say that, we can't send all this money over there when we have needs here, and you address this, that actually we're not sending most of the money over there. We're sending the money to Pennsylvania to build weapons, to build artillery shells, to build the guns and ammo that the Ukrainians are using to beat the Russians. So it benefits our economy. Some people say, well, this burden can't just be on us. America's always asked to do this, and it's not only on us. In fact, our European allies in NATO, most Americans don't know this because this is not the way it usually works. Our European allies in NATO are actually doing more for Ukraine than the United States is. On a per capita, per taxpayer basis, the Europeans are spending more than the United States. So they're doing their part. And then, of course, people ask, perfectly fair question, because the war has been terrible, how does this end? Can it go on forever? And that's a good question. It can't go on forever. I mean, the Ukrainians can't bear this forever, and they're a democracy. Their government has to answer to their people. And so as we think about that question, and we think about who we're going to elect in this election, our election, I mean, I'll tell you what I'm looking for. I'm looking for leaders who deep down understand that Ukraine is the good guy in this war and that Russia and Putin are the bad guy. You can't make good decisions if you don't have a basic moral understanding of who's on our side, who's on the side of right and justice in the war, and who isn't. Ukraine is the good guy, Russia is the bad guy. Number two, I'm looking for leaders who are not going to make any decisions about Ukraine's future without Ukraine. That should be a basic principle. They're doing the fighting. They should have a part in the decision about what the fate of their country is and how this war ends. Third, I'm looking for leaders who are going to give Ukraine the resources it needs to have leverage. If there's going to be negotiations to end this war, if there are going to be compromises, fine, but we want to make sure that Ukraine has the weapons to fight and to continue bleeding the Russian army so that they have leverage in that negotiation. And finally, I'm looking for leaders who will defend every inch of NATO territory in the way that Ronald Reagan would have, George Bush would have, Bill Clinton would have, Obama would have, McCain would have. Every leader we've had, Republican or Democrat, has made that pledge. I'm looking for leaders who will continue to govern in that tradition. There's this notion out there that, oh my gosh, we could just end the war tomorrow. The only way to end the war tomorrow is by giving Putin what he wants, which is a big chunk of Ukrainian territory forever, if not all of it, a promise that we will never allow Ukraine into NATO, and probably he would demand that we stop giving them all the arms that they need. The analogy I would draw is it's kind of like, imagine there's a bank robber running around hitting banks in your town, and the bank robber says, okay, I'll negotiate with you. I will stop robbing the banks as long as the banks get rid of their security guards and their security cameras. And then I promise no more bank robberies, right? That's what Putin is asking of Ukraine. Basically, become defenseless, and I promise I won't attack you again. And anybody who would negotiate on those terms is completely naive and not somebody who I would want to lead the United States of America at a very dangerous time. So that's what I'm looking for. That's what I hope we'll have. And we shouldn't forget how important this election is, not just to the future security of the United States, but to everyone in the world, particularly in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, who's fighting for their freedom. Thanks.
Can I just add one thing? There is one way that the war could end tomorrow, and that is Putin withdrawing his forces.
Well, yes.
And that's what has to happen.
I'll just make a few observations. This is the first time in the last 80 years that the world has not seriously been at war. And the reason for that, to a large extent, is the North American Treaty Organization. If it hadn't been put in place way back in the 40s, we would have had several world wars. And if you think about it in a big way, the birth of the United States occurred through the support of the French nation and the French people. They played the role we're playing with Ukraine today. And I think if you look at that historically, you can appreciate that we're making friends and doing the right thing toward democracy, the position we're taking. And I wanted to call your attention to sort of reflect on Ukraine and Poland, because it's an interesting area of the world in East Central Europe. Very talented people, extraordinarily talented people, very bright people, very accomplished people in mathematics, in music, in many areas of the world. But I had the occasion when Poland had its first revolution with Lech Walesa to go over and visit him the day that Poland became a republic again. And I recall landing at the area where he climbed over the fence. The name escapes me. Maybe you would remember, Tom, where his headquarters were located. And anyways, it's not consequential. When we arrived at his headquarters, we looked down, and on this huge 5 or 10-story building, there was a huge white sheet. And on the white sheet was 5-1, 51. And then we went down and met with Les, and the purpose of the meeting was really not a stupid thing, but an insignificant political thing. They were determining whether to go to a land-based telephone system and replace the lines in Europe, or to go to the more modern cell phone system. And I was bringing some representatives of AT&T and other organizations over to meet with Lenza to go over what alternatives meant here. And after a 3-hour intensive meeting, we left and started to walk up the hill, and he showed us where he climbed the fence, where he made the decision for freedom and democracy. And then I couldn't help but ask him. I looked down and I saw, again, this flag or banner hanging down several stories with 51. I said to Mr. Lenza, what is that 51? Is that the address? It's so huge. And I said, he said, oh, Congressman, we just wanted you to know that we want to be the 51st State of the Union. That's how much they loved America, and what an influence historically America has on countries like Poland, and is having today on countries like Ukraine. And we have the opportunity now, because we've not had a world war for 80 years, to really march forward with being a major part of the world revolution and change. And even with the old Soviet Union, now the Russian Empire, when you really look at it and think of it, if only we could hope we don't, or we will lose, and God knows we'll lose Putin someday, but hopefully that we will go into a more democratic Russia. And if we do, that we in the United States and the NATO nations of the world are smart enough to invest in a new Marshall Plan for that portion of Europe. And when you look at the European complex, the Americas that can come together, and the systems that we've developed over these last 80 years, and indeed in the United States, last 250 years, we, I think, are at that edge of an entire changed world, which America will have really cast the most influential role. But we should always remember our forebears and who helped us. If it hadn't been for the French in supporting the Revolutionary War, America wouldn't be here today. And I will add one thing because of my friend Joe Biden. I feel sorry that he's paid this terrible price, but what an honorable man and what an honorable price he paid. And, I keep thinking historically, who is Joe Biden in the world? And I don't know how many people would identify knowing the name Konrad Adenauer. It was Konrad Adenauer that was responsible for the democratic birth of the German nation and bringing it together. And he was an old man too. And they didn't throw him out. They were smart enough to utilize him. But I hope that someday we'll see the historians write about Joe Biden, that he was our Konrad Adenauer and the world's Konrad Adenauer. It's vitally important. And with the talent that lies in the Ukraine and in Poland and the Eastern Bloc nations, just phenomenal opportunity for the world, phenomenal opportunity for America. And one of these days, somebody's going to come up with world citizenship as a concept. And we'll start down that road and hopefully have the 80 years of peace that we've had in the last 80 years for another 80 years. And if we can do that, and you look off into the future, that would be the 22nd century. It's not unreasonable to assume that the world will so significantly change that war will become obsolete. It doesn't have to exist. We don't need disturbed men like Putin. What we need is brilliant men like Marshall, like Truman, like Adenauer, and indeed some of the fortunate leaders we've had in the United States in the last 80 years. So anyway, let's hope and keep our fingers crossed that, we're on our way to world citizenship. How fun that would be. Just think that men no longer want to kill each other, but want to see the world fed, the world educated. Our friends that have multi-languages, I'm talking to the doctor down there, wouldn't it be so great that just probably 10, 15 years from now, all of us will have a common language run by a computer that we will be able to walk to every corner of the world and converse with each other, instead of having the multi-languages and separations that we have today. All these things are going to be possible, will be possible, only if we're smart enough not to destroy ourselves in the meantime and stupidly retreat back another 100 years by going through that type of revolution. I don't think we will. My optimism is thorough at this point. I think the human race and civilization is on its way to accomplishments the likes of which we can't even imagine, and within the next 2, 3, 4 generations. I'll leave one thing. When I was in Washington, I had a friend of mine, she happened to be Polish too. She was a neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins, and occasionally I would have dinner with her. I always try to find bright people to have dinner with. It's amazing what you can learn from them. But anyway, she always was every time she'd meet me, she'd look at me and say, "How are you feeling, Congressman?" And I didn't know whether, as a doctor, she was seeing something defective in me and that I should notify everybody about my short longevity. But anyway, she said, the reason I ask you that, she said, is that I firmly believe that within the coming generation, we'll start to see the average age 120 years. And that within 3 to 4 generations, mankind will live to a ripe age of 400 or 500 years. Think, if that's possible, what we can do and what contributions mankind can still make with those, as my friend Bob says here, when you have your 18th PhD. Because you'll be able to do that with that type of longevity. So anyway, I want to thank everyone who's participated. I want to open up for questions. That's the first thing here. My friend?
We don't need a mic, I can talk as loud as Tom.
Well, it helps with the recording.
So, obviously, we're all concerned about Ukraine, we're all concerned about Eastern Europe. Why can't the United States and its allies bring Ukraine into NATO? Because Russia does not want to fight Poland, Germany, England, America, France, etc. It would only make sense if you want to put power with power. You'd have to, I realize we don't want anybody to die and get into more battles, but I think he would get very, very concerned if that would happen, and that would prevent a lot of his desire to keep on going through Europe. And to me, whether China helps them or North Korea, I do not think they would sacrifice themselves to the whole Western world. So I don't really understand. I mean, I know they want to at some point, but some point may be too late.
Right. So it's a great question, and I would say among people who are pro-Ukraine, there are 2 different answers to that question. Obviously, if you like Putin, then you don't ever want him in NATO. But among people who are pro-Ukraine, there's one argument that yes, Ukraine should be in NATO, but not until the war ends. Because, the argument goes that, if a member of NATO is at war, then we as their ally automatically have to go to war on their behalf. So if you allow a country that is at war into NATO, it somehow automatically brings the United States into the war. There's some logic to that, but there's also a problem with that argument, which is that if you say we will not bring Ukraine into NATO until the war ends, you're giving Putin yet another incentive to never end the war, right? He can say, even if there's some sort of, ceasefire or deal, if I just fire 1 artillery shell a week across the line, the Americans will never take that step of bringing NATO in. And so the alternative view, and this happens to be my view, although I respect the folks on the other side, is that we need to come up with a way, a formula for bringing them in, as long as they meet all the criteria, right, that every other country meets, where the defense commitment that we make under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, all for one, one for all, we will defend you. That defense commitment basically applies to the part of Ukraine that is under the control of the Ukrainian government. So we're not committing ourselves to go to war with American GIs fighting to take back Crimea, fighting to take back the parts that Putin currently controls. And even then, if you look at the NATO treaty, what it basically says is, if your ally is attacked in some way, you've got to consult with that ally and then do kind of whatever you think is necessary to make sure the security of our transatlantic area is protected. So that, in some cases, could mean U.S. troops, but it could also mean troops from other countries. It could mean, we could decide we're already doing a lot by giving you all of these weapons, maybe a U.S. Patriot missile battery, where they're way behind the front lines. There are a lot of different ways that you could meet that commitment. So I tend to think we have to be creative. We've got to find a way, as long as they meet the standard criteria, to do it even if Putin hasn't signed on the dotted line. Otherwise, he will never have the incentive. It's scary for some people. But you got to remember the basic principle of NATO. The basic principle of NATO is that you promise to go to war if necessary, so that it's never necessary to go to war. And that's scary. Like, remember when NATO was created, one of the first countries that we let in was Germany. And it was divided, and we had Berlin that was divided. And there were multiple points in the Cold War where we might have gone to nuclear war with the Soviet Union over Berlin, over Germany. That was a lot scarier than the promise that Ukraine is asking us to make for them right now.
Wouldn't it be, I totally agree with everything you're saying. Mike, the big question is, so if we let Ukraine into NATO and they met the criteria that everybody else met, then I don't understand, to stop Putin, he's not stopping. He's not going to. As long as he's the prime minister, whatever he is, of Russia, he has no incentive to stop, because he'll bring in North Koreans, who knows what else he'll do, because he truly feels he's in a powerful position.
Right.
So to put Ukraine by itself to push back seems unlikely. Obviously, we're helping them with military aid and all that kind of stuff. But I can't believe for 1 second, the first thing that Putin would say if there was a ceasefire is they never get into NATO. Because he's afraid of NATO. Believe me, as much as he talks big, he truly does not want to confront the whole Western world.
Right, so that is one of his stated conditions for peace with Ukraine. That's why I made the bank robbery analogy. It's like the bank robber saying, I'll stop attacking you if you become defenseless. Look, he'll never agree to Ukraine being in NATO, so if it happens, it's just something where you just agree to disagree. We're going to do it, we know you're going to be against it, and the reason to do it would be that NATO is the greatest deterrent of war that has ever been invented. I firmly believe that. Like, if you believe in peace, and I believe in peace, the most successful thing we have ever done to advance peace in the world is this mutual defense treaty that we have with NATO. We also have it with Japan, South Korea, some countries in Asia. It's scary, but it has a 100% track record of preventing war. And I don't believe Putin would attack a NATO country. I mean, look at the Baltic states, tiny, right? They'd be easy to overrun, but he doesn't do it because they're NATO allies. I think he respects that. And so I'm not supposed to be partisan here, but if you look at the candidates out there, one of them has already conceded this. One of them has already said that Ukraine should give up on being able to join NATO.
Can I just add one other thing as well, which is that, at least in my view, not only is it a question? But there's also the answer. I mean, Ukraine must join NATO. Must join NATO, again, for Ukraine's security, but also for our own. Because at the end of the day, if Ukraine, there's some sort of a peace worked out, satisfactory or not, but at the end of the day, if there are not security guarantees, like ironclad security guarantees, and the only way that I know to give that to Ukraine is through NATO membership. And given, frankly, the sad history over the last 30 years with, so-called security guarantees for Ukraine, Ukraine is going to be worried if it's not a part of NATO. And so imagine this, there's some sort of a peace, but Russia's character is not going to change. We know that Russia over centuries has been an historically expansionist empire. Russia's appetite for Ukraine and for other points west is not going to change. And so we need to come up with not only the deterrent that Tom is talking about, but the security for Ukraine itself, so that Ukraine doesn't become a free radical, on the edge of Europe, bordering, with this huge, long border with Russia, knowing what Russia's proclivities are. And Ukraine arming up, right? Getting ready for that next one. And we've seen that over history, what that means. And so I think that, again, perhaps sometimes counterintuitively, as Tom said, NATO, on the one hand, it seems like a very scary further step, but it is actually, I think, the only guarantee that we've got for peace. There would, though, be some time before Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. And so what many maybe not many, but what a number of people are talking about is a steel bridge to NATO. So what is that steel bridge of guarantees and security for Ukraine so that Russia is still deterred and Ukraine is feeling secure enough? Part of that are the bilateral security guarantees that a number of countries, including the United States, have recently signed with Ukraine that over the next 10 years guarantee we are going to provide X, Y, and Z. And so, these elections, coming back to the point that Tom has made several times, are consequential. One candidate obviously will honor those agreements that we have made with Ukraine. I think it is probably unlikely that the other candidate would.
Why? Okay, so everything you just said.
We can come back, but if there's another question, let's.
Well,
yeah.
we're staying on the same topic. I'd rather just stay there and move on. Just
We
for a
are
second.
limited, so real
Okay,
quick.
just 1 second. The only thing I don't understand, so everything I said, you basically agreed with, and you basically agreed with. They need to be in NATO. How about just the idea that they are now entering the phase of being considered for NATO would upset Putin enough to make him back off a little bit? A 10-year plan is a lot of dead Ukrainians, and that's unfortunate.
So I'll answer it this way. Like, this applies to NATO and every other aspect of our Ukraine policy. What Putin is asking is, does the United States have staying power? Whether it's the providing them with guns and ammo made in Pennsylvania and everywhere else, whether it's diplomatic support, whether it's insisting that any negotiation is not going to compromise these basic principles, whether it's keeping Ukraine on the path to NATO, however that works, shorter or longer. What Putin's looking at this election too, and he's going to get a signal: is the United States going to stick with this for as long as it takes, or are we going to start backing away? His actions in the next 2 or 3 months will depend on the signal that we send.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up here in a minute here.
Can we get them? I think we can get one more question.
One more
here.
question?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say, I think that we think of time as being not on the side of the Ukrainians, but in fact, Putin is not going to be in power forever either. So to the extent that we can make a decision now that is a 4-year decision or an 8-year decision, he's going to be, 76, 80. Russia is going to have to go through some kind of transition, and the way he's governed, that transition is probably likely to be a little rocky. So, you know, he has to some extent, Russia has to some extent a clock too, it seems.
For whom the bell tolls.
Well, that's one reason I think that he tried to take all of Ukraine now, and I think he thought he could do it very quickly because he saw the United States recommitting to NATO. He saw the United States stepping up its assistance to Ukraine. He may have thought he didn't have a lot of time left, and we obviously proved him wrong because we did stand by Ukraine at that critical moment, and Ukraine didn't bend. Now, the question is, as you suggested, is this a 4 to 8 year commitment, or is everything going to change in the next few weeks? And look, he's a practical person. He may be evil, but he's not stupid. And if he'll do what he thinks he can get away with, if we send a signal, we as the American people, we're going to stick with this. We're going to have leaders who will stand up to Russian aggression and stand by our allies. That will enter into Putin's calculations. If we send a different message, then we're going to have more aggression from Russia. And I fear that aggression will eventually be felt by we, the American people.
Bob, I'd love to thank the speaker. I know they all have other commitments at 3:30 just down the road, which is also an open event where they may be able to talk more in another forum.
Yes.
The JCC is also closed, so I just want to be
Okay.
respectful of everybody's
I
time.
would like to make one note, that the Polish foreign minister has stated a couple of days ago that Poland is already under attack. And we should recognize that. It's a cyber attack and sabotage. It's not massive troops on the border. But I think that's their whole point here, is that we all should be worried.
And I think.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
Oh, good to see you again.